Dorset, October 1814. The house party had been arranged by Lady Iversham, which meant it had been arranged with the quiet, surgical patience of a woman who believed that most problems between people could be solved by geography, and that the remaining problems could be solved by time, and that she personally was qualified to administer both. Her godson, the Duke of Threlbourne, required company, not a wife. Lady Iversham was far too careful a strategist to use that word with a man who had already buried one and had rebuilt himself around the loss like a wall erected around a garden that no longer grew anything. What he required, she had determined over the course of a long summer of watching him run his estate with flawless competence and eat his dinners in flawless silence, was interference. Specifically, the interference of Saran Draycott, daughter of Alistair Draycott, whose shipping concerns in Bristol had made the family fortune, and whose education at her father's desk had made the daughter formidable. Lady Iversham had not consulted either party about this conclusion. She had written to Mr. Draycott, mentioned the library and the October countryside, and trusted that a man who had spent 23 years raising a daughter, who could read a shipping contract at 14, would understand the shape of what he was being offered. Saran had been at Threlbourne Hall for 11 days when the Duke told her she irritated him. 11 days was long enough to learn a house. She had learned it the way she learned most things, with focused, quiet attention, believing that rooms told you more than the people inside them were willing to. The library was immense and disordered, the books shelved by size rather than subject, which offended her in a way she recognized as personal and did not apologize for. The morning room faced east and was cold by noon. The south drawing room had excellent light and terrible furniture. The kitchens were well run. The stables were better run. The estate office, which she had walked past 6 times before she understood why the door was always closed, was where the Duke spent the hours between breakfast and dinner, conducting his property with the precise, unbroken attention of a man performing a duty he had perfected and had long since ceased to enjoy. She had also learned the Duke. This had taken less time than the house, because the Duke, unlike the house, was not complicated. He was organized. He was civil in the way that men are civil, when they have forgotten there is anything beyond civility. He was punctual to an almost mechanical degree. He said good morning at breakfast and good evening at dinner, and between those 2 fixed posts he produced nothing that resembled conversation and nothing that resembled warmth. And the household moved around him with the practiced caution of people who understood exactly how much silence was expected and had stopped testing the boundaries of it. He also watched her. She had noticed this on the 3rd day and had spent the following 8 cataloging it with the dispassionate interest she brought to all observable patterns. He watched her when she spoke at dinner. He watched her when she walked the south garden before breakfast. He watched her when she stood at the library shelves, reorganizing the poetry section because she could not physically bear the disorder for another hour. He watched her the way a man watches something he had not accounted for in his schedule and was not certain how to classify. On the 11th morning, she was in the breakfast room reading a letter from her father when he entered, earlier than his habit, and stood at the sideboard for a moment without serving himself anything. Then he sat down across from her and said, with the careful enunciation of a man who had selected each word individually and was delivering them in the exact order he had settled on, "Miss Draycott, I find that every time I see you I am irritated." She set the letter down. His expression was one she had not catalogued before, not the civil blankness, not the mechanical courtesy, something underneath both of those, something that had edges to it. "You rearranged the poetry shelves?" he said. "They were organized by the author's first name," she said. "By first name, that is not a system. That is an accident preserved by habit. You corrected my steward on the Southfield rotation. Your steward was mistaken. The rotation he proposed would have exhausted the soil within 3 seasons. I have been handling crop rotations since I was 15. You have opinions," he said, "about everything in this house. I have observations," she said. "They become opinions when no one else appears willing to make them." The expression with edges held. The morning light was behind him, and the room was quiet, and the rest of the house party was still upstairs, and it was just the 2 of them and the thing he had decided to say and the space it was now taking up between the teacups. "I have run this estate for 9 years," he said. "I have kept it capably. I have kept it alone. I did not invite you here to improve upon it." "You did not invite me at all," she said. "Lady Iversham did." Something moved behind his expression. Not anger. Something older than anger, and more tired, and far more careful. "No," he said quietly. "I did not invite you." She understood then, with the clarity she brought to every piece of information that mattered, that the irritation had nothing to do with the poetry shelves, or the crop rotation, or her opinions about the furniture. The irritation was about what her presence had exposed in a house arranged around absence, and how thoroughly she had illuminated exactly how much absence there was. She understood it, and she did not say so, because some truths were not ready to be spoken by a guest across a breakfast table on an October morning, and because the man sitting across from her was not yet ready to hear them from anyone, let alone from her. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. She had been counting since she was a girl. It was a habit her father had taught her during negotiations. 5 seconds of held eye contact communicated a very specific thing. It said, "I have heard you completely, and I have decided what to do with what I have heard, and you will not be part of that decision." Then she folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate, and stood. "Thank you for your hospitality, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was level and carried warmth and contained no trace of injury, because she had decided in the space between second 3 and second 4 that she would not allow him to know he had landed anything. "I will arrange my departure this afternoon." "Miss Draycott," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that had not been present in any of the previous 11 mornings, something that suggested the speech he had prepared did not include her leaving. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. She left the breakfast room without looking back, climbed the main staircase with the unhurried composure of a woman concluding her business, and found her maid in the guest room. "Pack everything, Nell. We leave before dawn." Her maid, who had been with her since Bristol and had witnessed this particular calm before and knew exactly what it meant, said nothing and began folding. Saren stood at the window and looked out at the Dorset countryside in the October light, the gold and rust of the late trees along the south garden wall, the stable roofs, the edge of the east wing where the estate office windows faced the drive. A man who had told her she irritated him and had meant something else entirely, and did not yet possess the language for what that something was. The quality of his watching over 11 days, tracked through rooms, and the way his irritation had arrived at the breakfast table, already fully formed, as though he had spent the night assembling it from materials that had nothing to do with her. She considered what it would feel like for him, sometime before Christmas, when the irritation was gone and the silence was back, and there was no one reorganizing his shelves or correcting his steward, or sitting across from him at breakfast with opinions about everything in his house. She did not sleep. She did not need to. By 4 in the morning the carriage was loaded. By 5 she was through the Threlbourne gates. By the time the household stirred, the guest room was stripped and bare, and the only evidence that Saren Draycott had spent 11 days at Threlbourne Hall was a note left on the breakfast sideboard, folded once, addressed to Lady Iversham. It read, "Thank you for the invitation. The library needs a better system. Saren Draycott." And in the poetry section, the shelves remained in the order she had imposed, which was the correct order, and which would remain correct long after she had gone, which was, she had decided somewhere between the second and third trunk, a perfectly satisfactory last word. Except that it was not, she discovered halfway to Bristol, a satisfactory last word at all. It was the opening line of an argument she had not yet decided how to finish, and that was considerably more irritating than anything the Duke of Threlbourne had said to her over breakfast. Brackenridge was purchased before November was out, 140 acres of mixed farmland and pasture running along the north bank of the River Cerne, with a stone farmhouse in need of repair and a reputation for poor drainage that had discouraged every buyer. Saren had found the listing on her second day back in Bristol, which was faster than she would later admit. She had her father's solicitor in Dorchester within the week. Her father, reading the surveyor's report at his desk, said nothing for some time. Then he said, "The Cerne runs through Threlbourne land." "It does," she said. Brackenridge sits upstream of the Threlborn estate. It is well positioned, she said. The water access alone makes the investment sound. Her father regarded her over the report with the expression of a man who had taught his daughter to read contracts at 14, and was now watching her deploy that education in a direction he had not anticipated but recognized immediately. "This is about the Duke," he said. "This is about 140 acres at below market value," she said. "The location is incidental." He set the report down. "Saren, it is a sound investment, father." A long moment. He did not argue further. He had raised a woman who made decisions the way he made them, with conviction and with evidence, and with the understanding that some evidence was for other people and some was entirely private. He signed the purchase authorization that afternoon. She told herself it was entirely about the acreage. She maintained this position for approximately 3 weeks, at which point she stopped pretending and simply stopped explaining. She arrived at Brackenridge on the first Monday of December. The farmhouse was cold and small and had none of the proportions of Threlborn Hall, which was a considerable relief. There was no one here to watch her through rooms. There was no one here to be irritated by her observations. There was only the land and the river and 140 acres that needed her attention and would repay it without commentary. The first week she walked every field, every hedgerow, every foot of the riverbank. The property was neglected but not ruined. The soil was good. The pasture was overgrown but recoverable within a season. The river was the real asset, clean and steady, running south through a shallow valley toward Threlborn land where it fed the Duke's mill and irrigated his south meadows. The Duke was informed of his new neighbor by his steward during the weekly estate meeting, delivered with the careful neutrality of a man mentioning something significant while pretending to consider it routine. "Miss Draycott, Your Grace, the Brackenridge purchase completed on the 20th. The Duke set down the ledger. "Draycott," he said. "Alistair Draycott's daughter." "Yes, Your Grace." He turned toward the window that faced north, toward the river and the Brackenridge fields beyond it, where the bare December trees stood against a pale sky, and the land ran flat and open for half a mile. "The water records," he said. "The arrangement with the previous owner regarding the sluice gate. Has it been documented?" "It was informal, Your Grace. Nothing recorded. Have it reviewed. Before the month is out." His steward noted this and said nothing further, and the meeting continued, but the Duke glanced at the north window twice more before it was finished. She was standing at the old sluice gate on the Thursday of her second week, surveying where the Brackenridge watercourse joined the main channel, when she heard hooves on the frozen ground behind her. He came from the Threlborn side on a bay horse at a pace that told her he had known exactly where she was and had come with purpose. He reined up on his bank of the river and regarded her across the water with the expression she recognized from the breakfast room. The assessing one. The one that preceded a position he had already arrived at. "Miss Draycott," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not perform any greeting beyond the words. They were standing on opposite banks of a river in December. Formality belonged to breakfast rooms. "My steward tells me Brackenridge has been purchased." "It has. By you. By me." He was quiet for a moment. The river ran between them, not wide, perhaps 12 feet across, but cold and moving with the steady current of December rain. "The sluice gate," he said. "It governs the flow to the Threlborn mill." "I am aware of the sluice gate," she said. "The previous owner maintained an arrangement with the Threlborn estate regarding the water flow, an informal understanding." "Then there is no arrangement," she said. "There is a habit. Habits are not the same as agreements, Your Grace. I would have thought you of all people would appreciate the distinction." Something shifted in his expression, not the edges from the breakfast table, something that lived in the space between surprise and the effort required not to show it. "You are very direct," he said. "You told me you found directness irritating," she said. "I have simply moved it somewhere it can be usefully applied." The December wind moved through the bare willows along the bank, and the water between them was loud enough that the silence was not quite silence. "The mill supplies flour to the village," he said. "The water flow is not a private concern. Then I suggest we discuss it properly, with documents, at a time that suits us both. Write to me." he said. To your steward, you mean? I mean write to me, he said. Directly. He turned the horse. Good morning, Miss Draycott. Good morning, Your Grace, she said to his retreating back. Alone at the river bank, she turned over the word directly, and the expression that had not been the assessing one, and the fact that a man who had told her she irritated him had just ridden deliberately to her river to tell her to write to him in person. She went back to the farmhouse and did not think about any of it for the remainder of the day, with results she would generously describe as mixed. She wrote to him on Friday. The letter took 3 attempts. The first was too clipped, the second was too warm, the third was precisely what it needed to be. Factual, specific, and ending with a proposal to meet at the sluice gate with the relevant documents, which was the reasonable next step, and also the step that would bring her to his side of the river, which she was not going to examine with any particular care. His reply arrived the following morning, faster than she had anticipated, written in his own hand rather than a secretary's. Miss Draycott, I have reviewed the watercourse records. The arrangement with the previous owner was, as you observed, informal. I propose Monday next, 10 in the morning, at the sluice gate. Bring the deed of purchase. I will bring the Threlborn water records. Threlborn. She read this twice. No pleasantries, no polite construction, just the time and the documents and the expectation of her presence. She found this, against her more considered judgment, considerably more honest than elaborate courtesy would have been. Monday was cold and bright, the kind of December morning that stripped everything back to what was actually present. She arrived at 5 minutes before 10. He was already there, on foot, the water records rolled under his arm. He had brought his steward. She had brought her surveyor. Both parties drew their conclusions from this symmetry. They spread the documents on the flat stone wall beside the sluice gate and stood on opposite sides, reading each other's evidence with the focused attention of 2 people who were both entirely correct and entirely in conflict. The Threlborn records establish continuous use of the Brackenridge flow for 40 years, he said. Continuous use without a recorded agreement is not a legal right, she said. It is a courtesy extended by the previous owner. That courtesy expired with the sale. Customary rights in this county carry the practical force of legal ones. Customary force and legal right are different things, she said, and I find the distinction worth preserving. His expression had been shifting over the course of their encounters, moving by degrees away from the assessing one toward something that used more of his face and demanded more of his attention. You have done this before, he said. Negotiated a water claim. My father's shipping concerns involve extensive negotiation over port access and riparian rights, she said. I have been present at most of those negotiations since I was 17. Your father brings you to commercial negotiations. My father brings me to everything, she said. He has no sons. He has me. He decided when I was 12 that this was either a limitation or an advantage, and has proceeded on the assumption of the latter. She held his gaze. He has not been mistaken. A pause. Then he indicated the watercourse map. The mill requires a minimum flow to operate. If you reduce the upstream volume, the mill stops. The village loses its flour supply. If you claim an unlimited right to my water, she said, my fields flood every spring, and the pasture is unusable for 3 months. The previous owner tolerated this. I do not intend to. Then we have a conflict. We have a negotiation, she said, which is a conflict with a resolution built into it, provided both parties are willing to find one. I am going to make you a proposal, he said, a formal water-sharing agreement, recorded and binding, minimum guaranteed flow to the Threlborn mill during operating hours. Full upstream control returned to Brackenridge outside those hours, joint maintenance of the sluice gate and the shared channel. She weighed the proposal. It was fair. It was practical. It was the kind of offer a man extended when he had decided the person across from him warranted a proper resolution rather than a positional victory. You have 40 years of customary use, she said. You could bring this before the county magistrate and likely prevail. I could, he said. Why don't you? Because it would take a year and cost us both more than the outcome is worth. And at the end of it, one of us would have the flow and the other would have a grievance. And we are going to be neighbors for the foreseeable future. He met her eyes. I prefer functional arrangements to legal victories. I accept, she said, on the condition that the formal agreement acknowledges both legal positions, not merely the historical one. Agreed. She extended her hand across the stone wall. He took it, the firm, brief grip of a man who honored what he agreed to, and she noticed that his gaze, as their hands met, was no longer the assessing one. It was something she was going to have to find a name for sooner or later. That expression followed her through the afternoon and into the evening, and was still there when she finally sat by the fire and admitted, with the honesty she owed herself if no one else, that the water agreement was not the only arrangement she had spent the morning negotiating. The county dinners began in January. Dorset society in winter was a closed circuit, the same families rotating through the same dining rooms with the comfortable efficiency of long practice. Saren had been received with cautious interest. She was wealthy enough to be acknowledged. She was not titled enough to be absorbed. She was, several people had noted, extremely good at conversation, which in Dorset was either an asset or a complication depending on whose conversation she was improving. She and the Duke attended the same dinner 3 times in January. At Hartfield, they were seated at opposite ends of the table and exchanged exactly one remark about the water agreement, which was overheard by Mrs. Ashton and became the most discussed topic in the county for the following week. At Iversham Lodge, Lady Iversham had seated them across from each other with 6 inches of mahogany and the entire weight of her expectations between them. At Threlbourne Hall, a formal occasion for 14, Saren sat 3 places from the Duke and spent 40 minutes discussing river systems with Sir Gerald Ashton, because Sir Gerald was one of the few people at the table who understood sluice gates, and the spring flooding was already on her mind. During the conversation with Sir Gerald, she was aware that the Duke was listening. Not visibly. He was conducting his end of the table with the practiced precision of a host who had been doing it since he was 21. But she had developed, over the course of 3 dinners and 2 meetings at the sluice gate, a reliable sense of where his attention was actually directed. And it was directed at her with a frequency she noted and filed, and was not going to act upon. At the close of the Threlbourne dinner, Lady Iversham materialized at her elbow in the entrance hall. "You handled Sir Gerald beautifully," Lady Iversham said. "Sir Gerald knows a great deal about river systems," Saren said. "Sir Gerald knows a great deal about river systems, and remarkably little about anything else," Lady Iversham said, "which makes him indispensable at dinner and entirely irrelevant on every other occasion." She glanced across the hall at her godson, who was seeing off the last of his guests. "He has not watched a woman the way he watches you since." She stopped. In some considerable time, Saren studied her gloves. "I am aware of Catherine," she said carefully. "Catherine was a wound he turned into a way of living. Ways of living can be revised." A pause. "With sufficient evidence." "Lady Iversham, I purchased Brackenridge as a business investment." "Of course you did," Lady Iversham said, with the serenity of a woman who had been told the same thing in 3 different phrasings and had formed her own conclusion. "Good evening, Miss Draycott." February brought the kind of frost that Dorset produced once or twice a winter, the sustained bitter cold that turned the river sluggish and the ground iron hard, and made the sluice gate a genuine crisis. Ice in the channel overnight, the mill flow reduced to a trickle, the village miller sending word before dawn. Saren wrote to the Duke on Tuesday morning. He arrived at Brackenridge on Tuesday afternoon, which was not what she had expected. She had anticipated a letter or a message through his steward. Instead, he appeared at the farmhouse door in riding clothes and a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, which was a detail she noticed and declined to examine. "I thought seeing the gate would be more productive than a letter," he said. "It would," she said. They walked the length of the frozen channel together, and she showed him where the ice had accumulated, and where the original gate design had failed to account for sustained frost, and where the flow could be redirected through the secondary channel. He listened with the complete attention she had come to expect from him, and asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the mechanics, and one that told her he had already seen the answer. "If you diverted the inlet here," he said, indicating the diagram, "the fall gradient would break the ice before it set." "That was my surveyor's conclusion as well," she said. "The work would require access to the Threlbourne Bank." "You have it," he said. "I will inform my steward today." He was studying the channel diagram, breath visible in the February air, coat mud spattered at the hem, and none of it was the composed, mechanical Duke she had met at the breakfast table in October. This was someone who had come to look at a frozen sluice gate in February because he had said "write to me directly" and had meant the same in return. "You came yourself," she said. He glanced up from the diagram. "You could have sent your steward, or written." He held her gaze. "I told you to write to me directly. That standard applies in both directions." She turned toward the frozen channel, toward the Threlborn fields beyond the bare February hedgerow. A man who had told her she irritated him every time he saw her, and who had just walked a frozen ditch in February rather than send a note, and who had said "you have it" without requiring her to ask twice. "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical matter," he said. "The gate serves both properties." "Yes," she said. "It is entirely practical." His expression was never entirely the assessing one anymore. It occupied the territory between what he had decided about her and what the evidence kept showing him. They walked back to the farmhouse. She offered tea. He accepted, the first time he had accepted anything at Brackenridge, and they sat in the small parlor for 40 minutes and talked about the sluice gate, and then about the county road committee, and then about a book on agricultural drainage she had ordered from London that he had also read. And neither of them mentioned the breakfast room or the word "irritated" or the 11 days, and the afternoon was entirely practical and entirely not. The spring assembly was held at Hartfield in the first week of March. 40 guests, the full county. Saren arrived with Lady Iversham, who had developed the habit of collecting her before these events, without either of them having formally arranged it. The Duke was across the room when she entered, in conversation with Sir Gerald and 2 other men, and he glanced up when she arrived with the attention she had learned to identify and had stopped pretending she did not notice. The evening proceeded as county evenings did. Circuits of the room, layered conversations, careful social choreography. She discussed the spring planting with the Ashtons, the London season with 2 young women, the county road bill with Sir Gerald. The Duke appeared at Sir Gerald's side at some point during the road discussion and stayed, and the 3 of them talked until Sir Gerald was called away by his wife, and then it was just the 2 of them. And the conversation shifted without either of them steering it from roads to the sluice gate, to the spring flooding, to a question he asked about the shipping business she had grown up in. That was the first question he had ever asked about her, rather than about the land. She answered it. He listened. He asked a second. She thought, "This is what he sounds like when he is actually curious." She thought, "I should not be keeping a record of what he sounds like when he is actually curious." Sir Crispin Dacre arrived at her left shoulder. She had observed him circling for 20 minutes and had judged it within the normal range of a social evening. She was wrong about the normal range. "Miss Draycott," Sir Crispin said, with the tone of a man about to be charming in a way that required witnesses. 5 people within easy hearing. He had selected his moment. "Brackenridge is looking quite transformed, I understand. Considerable improvements." "Thank you," she said. "The sluice gate required significant work." "Sluice gates," he said, with a smile directed at his audience. Quite a theatrical pause. "One does wonder whether the scale of improvement is proportionate to the likely tenure. That is to say," he continued, "Dorset has a certain character, an established order. One hopes that newcomers appreciate the character of the county before undertaking too ambitious a program of renovation." The word renovation did the work he had designed it to do. In a neutral mouth, it was harmless. In his mouth, with his pause and his audience and his practiced smile, it meant you are a merchant's daughter playing at being a landowner. And everyone in this room understands the difference between playing and belonging. She held his gaze with the composure of a woman who had been navigating rooms since she was 16 and had encountered this particular variety of condescension in Bristol, counting houses and London drawing rooms, and had developed a comprehensive response to it. She was formulating that response when the Duke spoke. "The improvements at Brackenridge," he said from her right, in a voice she had not heard from him before. Not the breakfast room voice, not the sluice gate voice, not the dinner party voice. The one beneath all of them. The one that had 200 years of Dorset in it and understood precisely what weight it carried. Include a complete redesign of the water channel that has resolved a flow problem affecting both properties for over 30 years. He turned the assessing attention on Sir Crispin, the full force of it, the same gaze that had once been directed at her across a breakfast table and was now aimed at someone else entirely. The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone familiar with the Brackenridge land would confirm. Sir Crispin's smile underwent a rapid and visible adjustment. Of course, the county, the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not require volume, benefits from landowners who take their property seriously. I believe we can all agree on that. One moment longer than was necessary, the ducal equivalent of a closing argument. Then he returned to the conversation as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Sir Crispin found someone else to speak to with the speed of a man who had been corrected in public and needed time to reassemble himself. Saren stood beside the Duke in the aftermath, weighing what had just happened with the precision she brought to all important information. The weight of what he had said and the way he had said it, and the fact that he had chosen to say it at all, he did not turn toward her. He was already discussing the road bill with the two men from before, and nothing about his bearing suggested he had just done something significant. She thought, he knows he has. She thought, he is waiting to see what I do with it. She crossed to the far side of the room and stood with Lady Iversham, who studied her expression, then the Duke across the room, then her expression again. Well, Lady Iversham said. He intervened, Saren said. He did not have to. No, Lady Iversham agreed, accepting a glass of wine from a passing footman with the composure of a woman who had been waiting for this particular conversation for 4 months. And Sir Crispin will be considerably more careful for the remainder of the season. He said the improvements affected Threlborn. He made it about the land. He made it about the land, Lady Iversham agreed, so that Sir Crispin had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood his position without requiring him to make a declaration. And so that you were defended without being diminished. A pause, which is a very particular kind of intelligence. Saren held her glass and turned over 4 months of water agreements and frozen channels and February afternoons, and a man who had told her she irritated him every time he saw her, and had spent the subsequent months discovering that her presence was considerably more than he had accounted for. He was wrong about me, she said. In the breakfast room. Yes, Lady Iversham said. And he knows it. He has known it for some time. He is a man who takes his time with his accounts. He required sufficient evidence before revising the ledger. Saren recalled the 5-second gaze in the breakfast room, the one that had said, I have heard you and I have decided. The woman who had counted to 5 and turned away and packed before dawn. The woman standing in this room 4 months later with a wine glass and a water agreement and a county that was beginning to understand who she was. Across the room, the Duke met her eyes. Not the assessing attention, the other one. The one she had stopped pretending she did not notice. She held his gaze. She did not count to 5. She did not turn away. She held it for 1 moment longer than the social register required, then turned back to Lady Iversham and said something about the road bill, and the assembly continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. He called at Brackenridge on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the assembly, which was fast enough to mean the decision had been made before he left the room. She was in the upper field when he arrived, checking the spring drainage with her surveyor, which was not the condition in which she would have chosen to receive a Duke. But she had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime in February, and was not going to resume the practice now. He was at the Brackenridge gate, on foot, and he waited while she finished her conversation and walked back across the field toward him. She did not hurry. He did not appear to expect her to. Your Grace, Miss Draycott. He surveyed the upper field, the channels running clear in the March morning. The spring flow is working. It is. The Threlborn mill ran at full capacity this morning for the first time since November. The channel redesign resolved both problems. I am glad, she said. His gaze settled on the gate between them, which she had not opened. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. In the breakfast room, in October, what I said, the manner in which I said it. A pause. It was not how I should have spoken to you. He was studying the gatepost rather than facing her, which was the only sign that this was costing him something. I came to that breakfast table with a position I had formed before I sat down, a position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with. He stopped. Catherine, she said. His eyes found hers. I understood it in the breakfast room, she said. That morning. That is why I left. Not because you insulted me, although you did, but because I understood that you were not seeing me. You were conducting a history, a quiet moment. Yes. I am not Catherine, she said. I am not a correction for Catherine. I am not a livelier version of Catherine, and I am not a safer version of whatever you believe you require. I know, he said. I have known it since December. He turned toward the field. You are not a safer version of anything. You are the most disruptive presence I have encountered in 9 years of keeping a very orderly estate, and I mean that as a complete accounting of my situation. She weighed this. A man who had walked into a breakfast room with a wound dressed as a schedule and had spent 4 months watching the schedule be dismantled by sluice gates and water rights, and a woman who knew exactly how irritating she was and had purchased 140 acres of it at market value. You defended me at the assembly, she said. Sir Crispin was. You defended me, she said. Before the sentence was finished, he met her eyes. Yes. Why? A long moment. Because he was wrong. And I was the person in that room most qualified to say so, and the most obligated. A pause. And because you had already made the case better than I ever could, I wanted it stated formally. She turned this over, the 5-second gaze in the breakfast room, the leaving one, and what that gaze meant now, in this field, with this man who had stood at an assembly and said anyone familiar with the Brackenridge land would confirm it, and who had come to her gate and apologized without qualification. She opened the gate. Come in, she said. The upper field is worth seeing properly, and I believe I owe you tea. He came through the gate and fell into step beside her on the path toward the farmhouse. The March morning was clear, and the fields were draining clean, and nothing had been resolved, and everything had been said that needed saying first. There was more to say. It would keep until the tea. The tea was in the Brackenridge parlor. She had chosen it because it was where she worked, and because she was not going to arrange a room she did not have for a man she was no longer willing to perform for. This was not a morning call. It was a man who had come through a gate she had opened, and who had said because you had already made the case, and who was now sitting in the chair across from her desk, with an expression that had nothing guarded in it at all. Nell brought the tea and withdrew. Saren poured, handed him his cup, sat back in her chair. He surveyed the books behind her. The desk, covered in estate papers and channel diagrams and a letter from her father's Bristol solicitor. All of it read with the attention of a man taking inventory and finding every item legible. You work here, he said. Every morning. This room is the study, she said. It is also the parlor and occasionally the dining room. Brackenridge does not run to specialized rooms, Your Grace. He drank his tea. I see. Was that an objection? It was an observation. In my experience, women who work at desks covered in channel diagrams are either eccentric or formidable. Occasionally both. And which classification have you assigned me? I have been revising my classifications, he said, since approximately December. She considered the apology at the gate, the honest one, the one that had not deflected into explanation or wrapped itself in justification, the one that had named what he had done and named the reason, and stopped. She had spent 4 months trying to sustain her irritation at him with consistency, and had found the project increasingly difficult to maintain, and the apology at the gate had been the final piece of evidence that consistency on this particular point was no longer available to her. I want to say something about the breakfast room, she said. He waited. I understood what you were doing. The moment you said it, I understood that you were not describing me. You were describing what you needed after Catherine. Someone who would not disrupt anything, who would not rearrange anything, who would not be present enough to remind you of everything your marriage had lacked. She met his gaze. I did not leave because I was insulted. I left because staying would have required me to argue with you, and arguing with you in that moment would have forced you to defend a position you held for reasons neither of us were prepared to discuss. A pause. The 5 seconds were the only honest exit. The 5 seconds. The gaze, she said. Before I stood, it said what needed saying. I see you. I am not arguing. I am leaving. He studied the desk between them. It was the most deliberate thing anyone has done in my presence in 9 years. I considered it for a week. What did you conclude? That I had conducted the conversation very badly, and that you had conducted it better than I deserved. He held her gaze. And that the woman who held my eyes like that for 5 seconds and then left without a word was not a woman who found me irritating. She was a woman who understood exactly what she was seeing and had decided it was not yet ready to be addressed. A pause. It was not the quality I had listed in my requirements. No, she said. It was a better one. She held her cup and contemplated the man across her desk, and considered October and November and December and every month since, and what it meant to watch someone revise their accounting in real time, and to discover that the revised version was something she had not prepared for at all. Hadrian, she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title, and his grace, and the careful distance where a name would go, and now the name itself was in the Brackenridge parlor, and neither of them could retrieve it. Yes, he said. I bought this property because of you, she said. Not entirely. The land is sound and the investment was rational and all of that remains true. But I bought it knowing it was upstream of yours, and I told myself it was business, and I almost believed it for approximately 3 weeks. She turned toward the diagrams on the desk. I was angry. I wanted you to see me, not the fortune and the father, not the category I had been filed under. I thought that if I were your neighbor, if I were arguing water rights and correcting your steward in person, you would have to see me eventually. That was not a cautious strategy, she said. It was an effective one, he said. It produced a water dispute and a frozen channel. He paused. It produced you being here in this parlor having this conversation. I consider the investment entirely sound. He stood and came around the desk and stood before her chair, and she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were very close in the Brackenridge parlor with the March morning light through the low windows and months of water rights behind them. I was wrong about you, he said, in the breakfast room in October. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong in the meeting, and I am asking. He stopped. His expression had nothing of armor in it at all. I am asking whether I am too late to be right. She considered the 5-second gaze, the first one, the leaving one, the one that had said, I see you, and I am going. What that gaze meant now, in this room, with this man who had stood in an assembly and stated her case and had come through her gate and apologized without condition. She did not count. She held his gaze with no exit built into it. You are not too late, she said. He covered her hand with his. The full, undefended attention, the one that had been building since December, was now entirely present and entirely permitted. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his position for 4 months and had reached a conclusion he was prepared to act upon. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and channel diagrams and every true decision she had ever committed to. And the parlor was warm, and the March morning was outside, and none of it required any further arrangement. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm and wore the expression she had when she was not performing anything at all. The water agreement, she said, is settled, he said. The sluice gate is functioning. The upper field is draining. Are we conducting a full property review? I am establishing that the practical matters are resolved before addressing the impractical ones. And are they resolved? She regarded the diagrams. She regarded the man who had come through her gate and revised his ledger and called it a better quality, about a 5-second gaze he had spent a week thinking about. Yes, she said. They are entirely resolved. The corner of his mouth did the thing she had catalogued and was now permitted to acknowledge. You are going to be very difficult to be married to, he said. Is that a proposal? It is a preliminary assessment, preceding a proposal. I find assessments useful before major commitments. As do I. My preliminary assessment is that you will find it considerably harder to maintain an orderly schedule with someone who lives upstream and has opinions about everything in your house. I have noticed that my schedules have been performing poorly in this vicinity. They have been performing very badly. I would recommend a comprehensive revision. I am in the process of one, he said. He took her hand. Saren. Her name. The specific, irreplaceable weight of it. Hadrian, she said. And this time it carried everything she had not said since October. April in Dorset was the county at its most knowing. Gardens emerging, morning calls multiplying, the social calendar filling with the particular energy of a county coming out of winter and finding itself, as it always did, entirely unchanged and deeply satisfied about it. Saren and the Duke were engaged by the second week of April. He had proposed formally in the Brackenridge parlor on a Wednesday morning with the directness she had come to trust, and she had said yes with the same directness, and they had shaken hands on it before either of them registered the absurdity. Then he had studied their clasped hands, and she had laughed, a small and genuine and entirely unguarded sound, and he had received it with the expression she now recognized as his version of complete happiness. Her father received the news with quiet satisfaction. "The Duke of Threlborn," he said, from behind the shipping accounts. "The man who told you that you irritated him. He has revised that assessment considerably. He came through my gate and apologized without qualification. And then he sat in my parlor and drank my tea and told me the 5-second gaze was the most deliberate thing anyone had done in his presence in a decade." She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's October against him when his March is everything it should be." Her father set down the accounts. "Is he good enough for you?" She considered this honestly. "He is trying to be. That is the best version of the answer." "It is the best version," he agreed. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon. The Duke's reply, addressed to Saren rather than her father, read, "Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow. H." She placed it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9. Lady Iversham called on a Tuesday with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 3 days, which represented her absolute limit. "Well," she said. "Well," Saren agreed. "The parlor?" "The parlor. He kissed you in the parlor. I prefer not to confirm specific details." "You have confirmed them entirely," Lady Iversham said. She accepted tea with the composure of someone settling in for a complete accounting. "He was happy when he called on me yesterday. I have not seen him happy in 3 years. He showed it the way he shows everything, very quietly and without announcement. But it was there." She held Saren's gaze. "You are good for him. He is good for me," Saren said. "Which is the thing I did not expect." "What did you expect?" "I expected to prove a point. I expected to be here and be competent and make it impossible for him to sustain the position he had taken. I expected to be right." A pause. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." "What was he right about?" "That a woman who knows exactly how irritating she is," Saren said, "is a formidable thing. He had entirely the wrong definition of irritating, but the instinct was sound." Lady Iversham smiled, not the polished social smile, the real one. "He is going to discover that he has acquired a duchess who will run his estate better than he does. He has already discovered it. He mentioned it at least twice during the formal proposal. He proposed to you by conducting an assessment followed by a declaration. The declaration was excellent. The assessment was also excellent in its way. It was honest." She studied her tea. "I find I prefer honest assessments to elaborate ones." Lady Iversham stood. "The engagement dinner. I will host it. 1st week of May." She paused at the door. "Sir Crispin will be invited, because it is better to have him at the table where he must behave than outside it where he will not. And because the sight of Sir Crispin Docker congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Threlborn will be one of the most satisfying things I have witnessed in recent memory, and I am not above enjoying it." I find I am not above it either, Saren said. They were married in June, at the village church that sat in the valley between Threlbourne and Brackenridge, a very beautiful church with good stone floors and windows that had been there since the 15th century. She wore dark green, a better dress than October's, cut by someone who understood that dark green on a woman with her coloring was not a fashion choice but a settled fact. Her mother's pearl earrings, simple and correct for an occasion already saying enough. Hadrian was not surprised by the green. Lady Iversham was not surprised. Her father had simply nodded when she told him. The village turned out. Dorset turned out. The full county and a considerable number beyond, because the marriage of a duke was always an occasion. And the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the additional quality of a story the county had been following since October. Saren walked in on her father's arm and found Hadrian at the front of the church and considered the breakfast room in October and the 5-second gaze she had given him on her way out of his life. All the versions of that gaze. The first, in the breakfast room. 5 seconds. Counted. Deliberate. I see you. I have decided. I am leaving. The second, at the spring assembly, across the room after Sir Crispin, when she had found his eyes and held them without counting, without timing her exit. I see what you did. The third, in the parlor, when she had met his gaze and not turned away and not counted and not built any kind of departure into it. I am done performing for you. She had considered the fourth version. She had decided sometime in April that it would not involve a count at all. Hadrian's expression had nothing of October in it, nothing of the breakfast room assessment, nothing of the man who had organized his grief into a schedule and called it competence. Just him, entirely present, seeing the woman who had bought the upstream property and argued the water rights and fixed the sluice gate and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She did not count. She did not build an exit. She took his hand. He held it with the firm, steady grip of a man who meant what he agreed to, and then he did not let go. After the ceremony, in the June garden at Threlbourne Hall, he found her at the edge of the south lawn, surveying the view she had first seen in December from the opposite bank of the river. The roses, she said. They are in the wrong beds. The climbers should be on the south wall. The standards need the east border for the morning light. Is this your preliminary assessment of the marriage? This is my preliminary assessment of the garden. My assessment of the marriage is ongoing. And she contemplated the roses, the river beyond the garden wall, running clean and steady between his land and hers. The man beside her who had told her she irritated him every time he saw her, and had spent the following months discovering that the irritation was the first true thing he had felt in 9 years. Hadrian, she said. Yes. Every time I see you, she said, I am irritated. The June evening was warm around them, and the county of Dorset was doing what it did in June, which was to be so completely itself that there was no room for anything that was not true. And I find, she said, that I have no intention of stopping. He took her hand. She let him take it. The June light moved across the Dorset countryside in the long golden way of evenings that did not want to end, and the roses were in the wrong beds, and the river was running between two estates that were no longer on opposite sides of anything, and none of it required further arrangement. The best investments, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. She understood this one completely.